three poems which I chose to analyse as a part of this assignment each demonstrate effective use of techniques in order to help the writer portray their thoughts and feelings upon their chosen subject matter. The poem to which I was assigned to analyse was Exposure, written by Wilfred Owen. The subject matter of this poem is the passive suffering that the soldiers experienced, based on the personal experience of Owen in the trenches in the winter of 1917. Owen wrote most of his poems based on personal experiences. This poem in particular was written possibly as a way to express his frustration towards their endless suffering, yet as quoted in the poem 4 times, but nothing happens. There are many emotions in this poem, such as hopelessness and sadness. It builds up throughout the poem, although the same emotions are held throughout it. It seeks to let the reader feel how those soldiers felt, sitting in the trenches, having a greater chance of freezing to death than to die in any other manner, their passive suffering. The poem has many examples of alliteration, such as sudden successive. It also uses half-rhyme, for example, nervous to nervous and nonchalance to happen. Owens uses adjectives well throughout each stanza, ending each of them with an anticlimax. There are many examples of similes, such as like twitching agonies of men among its brambles, metaphors, such as flights of bullets, which is comparing the fire of the bullets to flights of arrows, allusion, being like the example being far off like the dull humour of some other war, and to God, and personification, which example is dawn massing in the east, her melancholy army. It has a very slow rhythm due to the use of half rhymes and an anticlimax at the end of each stanza. Owens uses many poetic techniques to create a vivid and dramatic impact on the reader, in order for them to believe how he felt, sitting in the trench waiting for something to happen. I believe it is a very successful poem. It achieves Owen's purpose, as it shows a different, yet just as bad aspect of the war. The second poem to which I chose to study was Mental Cases, also written by Wilfred Owen. The subject matter of this poem is about those who return from the war, but with mental conditions from what they saw and the actions that they were forced to do. The purpose of this poem is to appeal to the reader to realise the effect that war had on the minds of the young men who had to fight it. It aged them and disfigured them until they would no longer look like they were the young men who they were. The main emotions of this poem is sadness and an overall depressing feeling, as it shows just how much war had messed with these young men's heads. In this poem there are examples of alliteration, e.g. hilarious and hideous. This poem is not musical and does not use any rhyme. Owens uses very descriptive language in order to portray his message to the readers. It is his descriptive language which really paints a picture in your mind of these men and what they had to deal with, and why they are not mentally sound anymore. The language he uses, such as drooping tongues from jaws that slob their relish, and gouge these chasms round their fretted sockets, which describes the facial features of the men in a vivid and effective way. This poem is very rich in imagery, for example, purgatorial shadows, gouge these chasms, and mine the dead have ravished. It has examples of similes, for example, burying teeth that leer like skulls, teeth wicked, and personification, for example, memory fingers in their hair. Due to the complex diction used by Owens in this poem, along with the punctuation used, it is not a very fast-moving poem. This poem is a very good example of a poem that is very rich in imagery, which really hits home Owens' purpose for writing it. The structure of the poem is really successful in putting across what the soldiers look like and why. The third poem I chose out of The World Contracted to Us, it's called Daddy, and it's by Sylvia Plath. And the way I managed to link it with the theme of war, which my other two poems are written about is the poem is about Sylvia's or Plath's relationship with her deceased father. But the way that she describes it, it's like she's comparing her relationship with her father as that of the relationship between the Jews and the Nazis. The Jews and the Nazis obviously happened in World War II, which is part of a war. The purpose of this poem would probably have been a way for Plath to speak of her suppressed feelings towards her father, in an effort to get it off her chest. It unfortunately did not work, as she committed suicide approximately a year later. The main emotion found in this poem would be of frustration. The poem reads very similar to that of the nursery rhyme. There are examples in this poem of an onomatopoeia, for example, achoo. Especially at the start of the poem, it reads very much like a nursery rhyme, with relatively simple language, but as the poem goes on, the diction becomes more complicated as the imagery used becomes more detailed and the issues being addressed become more complex. This complements the poem as at the start she is talking on behalf of herself when she was 8, which is when her father died. So it would be understandable that when this happened she would write in an uncomplicated manner. But as she gets older and she comes to understand it better, she writes with more diction and more techniques. Plath has many examples of imagery in this poem. It has examples of similes, for example, in which I live like a foot. Metaphors, for example, comparing her relationship to her father to that of the Holocaust, and the relationship between the Jews and Nazis, an allusion to the Holocaust itself. It has a very slow rhythm, as it reads much like a nursery rhyme. It is very simple and keeps the same movement throughout the whole poem. I find this to be a very shocking poem, that the loss of her father has left such a scar on Plath. Because he died when she was so young, when she had the impression that her father was immortal, she had to grow up with that void. She then hated and resented him for leaving her, their relationship becoming cold and unfriendly, like that between the Nazis and the Jews. Thank you.